Hello there, and welcome back to the Level 2 lessons for the Star Wars Unlimited Judge program. As always, I'm your host Jonah, and today we're going to continue our lessons on the tournament regulations and related concepts. We're going to start to talk about player communication, what players can and can't say, and how they should best communicate. We're also going to start talking about policy philosophy. Policy philosophy is the ideals and thoughts that form the structure behind the actual regulations laid out in the tournament regulations and comprehensive event guide. Mastering policy philosophy is not an expectation of level 2 judges. At this level, it's simply important to know what the policy says to do because you'll be able to handle the majority of situations you encounter with that baseline policy. This is an area that is continually being refined and will grow and evolve as play also continues to evolve. This does make it a bit of a challenge to both learn and teach, so this is likely a lesson that will similarly evolve over time. So, here's a big question. What actually constitutes communication? It's a very broad umbrella term. It's all about how players interact with each other, and it's not just what they say, but includes nonverbal communication such as gestures, manipulating cards, and more. Exhausting a unit with an action ability that requires exhausting says, I'm using this ability without actually using the words. Revealing a Vanquish, exhausting 5 resources, and tapping your opponent's Vader with your Vanquish says, I'm playing Vanquish and defeating your Vader, again, without the words. One of the challenges of communication is that the things that people can do or say is very broad and can change dramatically from one part of the world to another, which can cause issues to crop up when players travel to events further from their local area. It doesn't even have to be international travel. I've encountered many times a player going to a game store just one town over and being confused about how the tournament structure or how people communicate their own plays. Communication policy strives to help players align so that the game rolls out smoothly. So, what is the goal of communication policy? The goal of any policy is to try to keep the games fun and fair. We want the game to end with the rules having been followed and the person who played better, built their deck better, and drew the right cards to be the person winning. But we also want both players to feel satisfied with that outcome. Policy is where we, as judges, begin to intervene more with games, where we correct things and try to restore the way things should have been. If a judge comes in and dramatically changes things and reveals information or changes how things resolve without considering the consequences, it can feel to players that the game is in an unnatural state, and they would have both been better off calling a judge, which is something we want to avoid. To that end, an underlying concept is how would two players, if they were playing casually at home, resolve this situation? We ask this question because it can lead to better results. This isn't how every call should be adjudicated, and treating matches that have high stakes as though they don't have any stakes is a great way to make players not trust your judgment. However, what is a fair and reasonable fix generally remains consistent. You want to make sure that the player who made the error or communicated less is not advantaged, and you want to make sure that the game state is as close to legal and natural as possible. Furthermore, those fixes that players would come up with at home, oh yeah, just take out your sideboard cards and put in your main deck, we can keep on playing, or right, I'll just put the extra damage on it now, are intuitive to players. The more complex and labyrinthine we get with our fixes, the more time needs to be spent explaining it to the players. The higher chance they don't understand it, but just accept it with a shrug saying, well, you're the judge, I guess, and consequently don't feel satisfied at the end of the ruling and get put off from calling for a judge, which is again something we want to avoid. This is definitely a bit more of a peek behind the curtains as to how and why policy is written the way it is, and we'll talk about it more as we explore each aspect of policy. This philosophy is important because, as we discussed, everything players do won't fit into neat boxes like the rules. They'll fall into general categories, but many interactions will be unique, and your job and responsibility will be to use your judgment to best resolve the situation. Rules can be clear and concise. Rules work wholly within the structure of the game and its mechanics. Policy cannot be both perfectly clear and very concise. You need to be interpretive because the documents can't cover everything players can and will do. We can either have short policy documents where there's a lot of individual discretion, which is great for casual tier events or relaxed events, or we can have longer documents with more consistency, better for larger and more competitive events or master tier events. But that's enough on philosophy. Let's start talking about the details. Per the comprehensive rules, there are two types of information in the game, open and hidden. In the tournament regulations, there are 4 types of information: status, open, game, and hidden information. These additional types of information carry with them some additional baggage that's required at tournaments, but not required at casual games at home. Status information is information that must be announced verbally and tracked physically when it changes. Right now, there are 3 types of status information in the game, but that might change in the future. 1. The amount of damage on a player's base. 2. Whether or not the force is with the player. And 3. Whether a player has the initiative or which player has the initiative. You may notice that these are generally things that players already announce and track appropriately. They're also very important to the decision-making process for both players and can be very hard to keep up with if not tracked appropriately or announced appropriately. Open information is information that is available to both players. Players must answer honestly when asked about open information by their opponent. Open information includes the number of cards in a player's hand, deck, sideboard, and resource zone, the amount of damage on a player's units, previous actions from this phase, text of cards that were previously revealed, the card status and attributes of face-up cards in play or in discard, and the reverse side of leaders and any captured cards. While players aren't expected to proactively offer this information, it is important that players do communicate clearly and honestly about relevant game state knowledge. We don't want players to be rewarded for poor communication because that would incentivize poor behavior. However, players aren't expected to announce whenever these change or are modified because there's so much going on, and these aren't as persistently critical as status information. Game information is knowledge which all players are entitled to access, but players are not required to provide to their opponents. It includes generic information about Star Wars Unlimited and isn't necessarily specific to the game. Players are also not allowed to lie or provide incorrect information knowingly about game information. Game information includes attributes of all cards, whether in play or not, or whether they're in the decks or not. Game rules, including the full text of the comprehensive rules and how cards actually function. Tournament policy, including the full text of the comprehensive event guide, which is the tournament regulations, the competitive policy guide, and the relaxed policy guide. Any official information pertaining to the current tournament, such as number of rounds, total number of starting players, prize structure, and that sort of thing. And a player's deck list during the open deck list portion of an event. The deck list can only be accessed before the first game begins, but it does fall under game information. Players are not required to provide this information to their opponent because it is not reasonable to expect a player to know, say, the entirety of the comprehensive rules and the event guide. In fact, I don't expect judges or to know the entirety of both of those documents off the top of their head as well. However, players are not allowed to mislead their opponents about such fundamental knowledge. We can't have players lying about what cards do. Now, let's say you just played For a Cause I Believe In and revealed Chewbacca, Faithful First Mate, before putting it back on top of your deck. Then your opponent asks what his power and HP are, but you pretty much only play him as a pilot, and so you don't actually remember his stats. Players are not required to answer questions about game knowledge because they aren't necessarily going to know all of it all the time. But if they do choose to answer the question, they must not lie. Furthermore, players are entitled to this information and may call a judge to ask for clarification. While we dig a bit deeper into the example we just gave, I want you to think about why we treat this information differently than either open or hidden information. What would be the consequences of treating it the same? So, answers to the above question about Chewbacca that are valid include, I think he's a 5/5, but I never play him as a unit, so I'm not sure. I don't know. Let's call a judge. Or even just, I don't know. The first answer doesn't fully address the question, but gives a good faith attempt and lets the opponent know that the information may not be accurate. The second does the same and provides an avenue to resolve the issue. The third is also legal, but may result in a more contentious game, as players who cooperate and provide information more freely to their opponent frequently have a more positive experience. I've had a call where a player was asked a question of their opponent. The player said, I don't need to tell you that, that is game information. And then a minute later, after the player had determined what that information was, the opponent who had just said, I don't need to tell you that, that's game information, wanted to know the same information, so they asked their opponent, and their opponent said, I don't need to tell you that, that's game information. And so both players had to independently get that information themselves, whereas they could have just worked together and saved everybody a little bit of time. However, very often, if one player asks their opponent what a card does, the opponent will just reveal the card so they don't have to read it off. This revealing of hidden information is perfectly legal so long as the player who is revealing the card is legally entitled to access that information at that time, such as revealing a card from their hand or resources. Revealing a card off the top of the deck that they're not allowed to be looking at that time is not something that they're allowed to do. So, previously, I asked you to consider why we're treating this group of information differently than open or hidden information. Well, then players could simply not answer or provide false and incomplete information about the rules in order to gain advantage of their opponent if this was hidden information. This is obviously something that we don't want. On the other hand, if the type of information was open, then the rules, policy documents, and cards classified as information you must answer completely accurately. A malicious player could then ask their opponent, hey, what's Rule 5.6.4 in the CR? And then call a judge when their opponent doesn't know or isn't able to provide the information. And that, too, is obviously something we don't want. I do want players to know the rules, but I'm not going to penalize them for not knowing them perfectly. Hence, game knowledge. Players can't lie about it, but if they know it, they don't need to get a judge involved. If they don't know it, players can still get access to it so that their game can continue fairly. And that brings us to the fourth type of information, hidden information. Hidden information is information that is restricted in its availability. All information that is not another information type is, by default, hidden, but players can gain access to hidden information through various game mechanics. Unless otherwise granted, a player is not entitled to know the cards and sequence of cards in either player's deck, the cards in any opponent's hand, and all of the cards that have been placed as a resource by an opponent. These categories all include cards that were previously open information. Once a card is no longer revealed, the fact that it's in a particular zone or its place in a zone becomes hidden information. If a player is able to remember the card, they are able to ask for information about the attributes of that card under game information, but their opponent does not need to confirm that it is, for example, still in their hand. Players must do their best to communicate open information. In most cases, the information will still be present, so they can refer to a card or count the cards in a zone to give the appropriate information. This also means that if a player is playing with an altered card or a card in a foreign language, they need to be able to accurately represent the text of that card to their opponents. If a player intentionally misrepresents open information, such as giving incorrect information about how much damage is on their base, they should be investigated for cheating. Remember that the player must know that what they are doing is illegal for it to actually constitute cheating, and so a player who doesn't know communication policy may not be cheating, even if they are intentionally misrepresenting open or game information. On the other hand, with private information, players are allowed to bluff and in fact can tell outright lies. This can be as innocuous as, every card in my hand is good, or more specific with, I've resourced all of my late game threats. Players do not need to tell their opponents the truth about the attributes of these cards while they're hidden. However, if their opponent gains access to that information, such as with Viper Probe Droid or some other effect that lets them look at a player's hand, the revealed information is treated as open information for the duration of the effect. So, what happens if a player unintentionally breaks these guidelines? They think that they remember Chewbacca's stat line and say that he's a 5-5 when he's actually a 6-6, or they tell their opponent that a follower of the way with an experience counter on it is a 2-3 and not the accurate 3-4. This falls under communication policy error, covered in section 4.7 of the Competitive Policy Guide. The fix is dependent on the player actions or non-actions taken based on the error in communication. If I tell my opponent that the follower of the way is a 2-3 and so they choose not to attack it with their sentinel that only has 2 remaining HP because they want to keep it in play, the fact that the follower was larger than reported didn't actually change my line of play, and so the miscommunication didn't actually change the outcome or any of the decisions made. This does require determining a player's intentions and how they may have changed, which can require some investigation and may result in a backup, which will require further questions. Introductions to both of these topics will be covered in upcoming Level 2 lessons. If you do a backup in a situation based on incorrect communication, you generally shouldn't back up to the point of the error, where you would normally back up to, but instead back up to the point where a player acted or chose not to act based on the incorrect information, which very often is more recent. This is because everything between the information and action won't change, and backing up further than we need to only causes more risk. It's also important to recognize that this policy covers errors in communication policy, not general miscommunications between players, nor does it apply if the communication was corrected before a player made a strategic decision based on that information. If a player says, I have 3 cards in my hand, I'll attack your base, wait, I have 4 cards in my hand, their opponent didn't make a decision based on that communication, and so communication policy error doesn't apply. Furthermore, if a player makes errors based on their own communication, that also doesn't fall under communication policy error. However, this is something we'll explore more comprehensively in a later L2 lesson covering tournament disruptions. In any case, that's all for now. The next lesson will continue this exploration of communication, in particular discussing out-of-order sequencing, shortcuts, loops, and reversing decisions on an introductory level. If you're watching this on YouTube and you want more Level 2 lessons in your feed, go ahead and subscribe. Join us after lessons on twitch.tv/SWU_judges for live broadcasts covering the content of these lessons as they're released, and join the Star Wars Unlimited Judge Program Discord to join the community discussion of this and much, much more. As always, good luck and have fun.